Hey everyone, welcome back to the CGarchitect Podcast. I'm your host Rick, and today we are being joined by John Szot from Brooklyn Digital Foundry, the crew that just took home the Viz Pro of the Year award last year. Today we're getting the inside scoop on Brooklyn Digital Foundry, how they stay ahead of the curve, their creative process, John's vision of our industry post-pandemic, and what it really takes to be at the top of the ArchViz game. So, grab a coffee or whatever you're into, kick back, and let's do this. John Szot, thank you very much for being with us on the CGarchitect Podcast.
My pleasure.
I'm very glad to have you here. You guys won the Viz Pro of the Year on the 2023 awards, and I think for me it was no surprise because it was probably one of the first images I saw when I took over CGarchitect in July. It was probably the first one or among the first that I saw, and I was pretty impressed with it. So I'd like to start by having you talk about that image a little and how was it made, and then we can talk about the studio and so on. What do you think?
Sure. Well, that image in particular was for a speculative condominium development in Williamsburg, New York City. And we were working directly with the architect, which, sometimes we work with the architects, sometimes we work with the developers when we're putting together marketing information for real estate projects. We do a lot of that work in New York City, but we do significant amount of that work on of real estate marketing work on the West Coast as well, mostly in San Francisco. The key to an image like that one is good photography. Like, it really needs to start with a photograph that sets the tone and provides the proper compositional counterpoint. In this case, what we wanted to do was establish the city as a compositional equal to the development itself, which is featured in the foreground there on the left-hand side of the image.
Mm-hmm.
And there are actually 5 or 6 versions of that image in our portfolio, where we were trying different facades at the time with the architect, using some of the kind of fancier parametric plugins for Macs that allows us to make quick modifications on a limited basis and watch it kind of track across the entire facade. That the curtain walls featured in that image was the final selection by the architect, from there it was about trying to get the lighting to match up with the photo. Because when you're working with the photograph, you kind of have let the photograph take the lead in terms of the lighting and the atmosphere. While it's true, there's a certain amount of manipulation you can do to a photograph to modify those particular factors, that very quickly starts to push the entire image into a level of unreality that can build up quite quickly. We prefer to actually just kind of let the photograph take the lead. In this case, we did just that and worked very hard to make sure that the conditions in the building were flattering to the building, but didn't really violate the sense of light and space that the photograph had provided.
And how do you approach it? Because it's people sometimes think that it's easier to use a photograph as a background, and then you just put your model there and everything kind of clicks. And but it's not really like that. So what's your approach to that kind of situation? Because it's a beautiful photograph. You can see the breeze on the background and stuff. And how do you match the 3D model and your scene to the photograph? Like, well, you mentioned that you also manipulated photo. What's the proportion of that? Like 50-50?
Well, in this case, your listeners may find this disappointing, is that that particular photograph provide us with a tremendous amount of latitude in terms of how we put the model into the image, because there is no direct physical connection showcased in the image itself. You've got the building in the foreground, you've got the backdrop. And so in those cases, you can take a lot of liberties in terms of how you position the subject. Now, that being said, there are limits to it. Mainly the focal length of the camera is the thing that I think we were most sensitive to. Luckily, we had the EXIF data off of the, I believe it was a drone photo in this case, that provided us with all of the necessary lens specifications that we can very quickly put into something like V-Ray. We were working with V-Ray in this case. The V-Ray cameras provide us with a lot of excellent physical analogs in terms of the settings of the camera, and so we were up and running very, very quickly. It's just a matter of kind of fine tuning the location of the tower or the shot, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, we have tremendous latitude in that because we weren't showing where the building touched the ground. In cases where we're working with something with a ground level template, and in those cases, we find automatic camera matching tools for still images are not as developed or necessary as they are for video. So we'll typically go off of the EXIF data as the start, and then it'll be a little bit of a painstaking process to try and get the camera to match up in a way that makes the most sense, considering some of the other elements that inevitably we have to add to stitch the subject into the photograph in a convincing way.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that you guys are working on the East Coast and the West Coast of the U.S., right? And on the first episode of the podcast, I spoke to Neil Griffiths from D-Box, and he mentioned that he's currently located in Miami, and he said that it's very specific the way the things are in that region of the country are very different from, say, New York, right? Do you find many difference between the East Coast and the West Coast in regards to the look of the images and the way things behave, for example, the light and shadows and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think that is true. It's funny, like initially I thought this question was going in a different direction in terms of like the working context, like in terms of
we can talk about that too.
That I think is largely the same, because of the economics in the United States is pretty much identical from one city to the next. It's funny, I had a conversation with somebody about economics and politics in Sao Paulo while I was there, so long ago. In the United States, it occurred to the person I was having a conversation with, the Paulista, that they were like, well, here the economics follows the politics. I was like, yeah, well, that's the problem with the United States, is that the United States, the politics follows the economics. And in those cases, the bottom line for projects like the one we had rendered for the forward image, or I imagine many of the projects that our competitors are doing in Miami have very similar forces at work. But that being said, like the vibe, the atmosphere, absolutely totally different. San Francisco and New York are close cousins, but the one's connection to the natural environment in San Francisco is palpable, whereas in New York, I think we like to think that somehow we are suspended from those particular questions because of the ubiquity of the city and the intensity of the city. Miami really is about the ocean, and the hospitable and luxurious climate there that makes being sun-drenched one of the most desirable things about being in that city, and so it plays a big role in the imagery.
And then speaking of the weather, like when you go to New York, for example, you have snow, have very severe winters. And when you go to San Francisco, the winters are not that severe at all.
They don't know what winter is in San Francisco.
Yeah.
Makes that city great. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember I spoke to Giovanna Andreasen from Elephant Skin, and she was telling me that the interesting part of having an international studio is that you get to taste different vibes for your images. So you have some in Europe, people will probably like more overcast images and some snow, even. Whereas in Miami, people probably just want sun, sun, sun all the time. And I think that's although it's a very interesting exercise for artists, it's a really, commercially speaking, it's very hard to fine tune images so different from one another.
And I, my own position on that is that, you know, when you're dealing with real estate marketing, despite the fact that these cities have variable climates and those climates contribute to the personality of the city in a positive way, regardless of what those climatic factors might be, harsh winter versus a mild one, whatever. Because winter in New York City is an exciting time for lots of reasons. And when the city gets a blanket of snow on it, it's quite beautiful. And then there's the kind of negotiating the snow over the next couple of weeks, which is its own kind of cultural phenomenon. The real estate marketing images almost always end up in the same bandwidth of environmental factors, like, you know, something near magic hour to where the interior of the building could be showcased vis-a-vis the exterior without making the image look unrealistic, and ideally, you know, it's a climactic scenario, or it's a weather scenario where, you know, you could feel as comfortable being outside as inside. That's really important for a real estate marketing pitch, and that folds into a lot of the architectural competition work that we do as well. We have done images where we lean into less hospitable environmental conditions, fogginess or rain or snow, and almost invariably, unless they're trying to make a point about like using a hill for sledding down, you know, our clients seem to prefer mild meteorological presentations. So I envy the work of some of our competitors, where you'll go to their websites and see amazing images of dramatic buildings, kind of, you know, veiled in fog or kind of cast in silhouette by an amazing sunset. It hasn't really been our experience at the studio that those images are the ones that we end up producing, because of the obscurity that comes along with those presentations, and the potential for somebody misreading it as, you know, somehow less than perfect weather conditions mean the product in the image is undesirable. We all know that's not the case, and we all know that life is peppered by these kinds of moments that make you know, that it's that contrast that makes life interesting. But marketing is a very different animal, and because of the precariousness of it and the volatility of it, the weather question and environmental question usually ends up about the same place.
Which is kind of sad, isn't it? Because like we all already seen like beautiful images portraying different weathers and different situations, and I see those more often in Europe than in the States.
True. Yeah.
Which is very interesting, because for when we study architecture, you can see the differences between architectures in the different countries. And when you get to Europe, you can actually see that. And the one thing that I think it's you mentioned the culture of the places that are somehow attached to the weather, is that I remember I visited London twice in a couple of years, and the first time I went there, it was during the winter, and the city was something, and then the second time was in the middle of summer, and it was a totally different city with totally different people. Like the people were different, and I think that maybe the key to the marketing secret here is to find a balance, so you can actually make people feel like they are in their best version with regard to the architecture.
There's a lot of truth to that, I think.
Because that's the phenomenon. Because of course, you know, as we spoke before starting the recording, I live in Brazil, so we kind of live outside most of the year, because we don't have harsh winters. We have harsh summers, and that's another problem. But and we live outside most of the time, and when you get to places where people don't actually get to enjoy the outdoors all year long, you can see how it changes from one season to another. And maybe that's a challenge for ArchViz, trying to find that sweet spot where people will, recognize themselves in the images and still recognize it as their best version when they're the happiest.
Yeah, that's a really good point. On rare occasions, you'll come across a client who understands the nuances of the scenario you're describing. Let me try that again. I think all of our clients actually understand, the people we work with understand the nuances of that, but then their point of view on the kinds of conversations that they're going to be involved with over the work ultimately steer them towards something that is a bit more geared towards the mean within the kind of the range that you just described, and that's the kind of the temperate early evening, like perfectly balanced lighting kind of scenario. I can tell you, like, we've got a studio in Portland, Oregon, and that's where I'm actually speaking to you from. And the changes here in terms of the seasons are quite dramatic. The summers in Oregon are just absolutely perfect, idyllic, sunny, mild temperatures. And then you get into the winter and it's gloomy every day. Like the sun has not been out here for a couple of weeks. But everybody here changes in the way you just described. Like, they're comfortable with it. They're excited about it. They wear it as a badge of honor to think that they live in a place that has this particular kind of climactic outlook. It becomes a cultural thing in many cases, and it's always beautiful to see a piece of ArchViz that understands that and leverages that, locking the subject into that dynamic in a way that makes for a beautiful image.
Yeah, totally. Now, can you tell us a bit about Brooklyn Digital Foundry, the company, how it started, where is it now?
Sure. So we started the company in 1999, and at the time, computers were just kind of becoming a thing in architectural design. I mean, architectural documentation had already seen the kind of the introduction of CAD systems, primarily AutoCAD, but there are other platforms out there that are still lingering. Autodesk seems to have commanded the market pretty heavily. But the design question was still, computers were still absent from that part of the conversation by and large. And we, as students, we saw, the founders and I saw ourselves educated on the computer, but then in environments where the computer wasn't playing the same role that it was in some of the classes that we had been taking. And so my generation ended up being the ambassadors of the use of the computer at higher levels within the design process. This was also a time when architects didn't really understand why they would need a website. And some were starting to kind of get involved in building websites. And we were really, our studio was really heavily involved in bringing some of the most prominent names in architecture in New York City to the web. So all of a sudden we found our studio doing a lot of digitally based work, renderings and web programming for architecture studios, and then in turn for people involved in the real estate business. And then there was one day in, I want to say it was, it must have been 2004. I forget the year exactly. Where we were approached by OMA. They needed a video for a competition, and we happened to be experimenting with video in the studio. And we had this demonstration of a kind of a composite where we did a little bit of camera tracking through the native camera tracking tools in 3D Studio Max at the time, which were incredibly clunky and scary because they weren't predictable, which the keys in the conversation we were having earlier. And so we did this thing for them where we tracked a live shot of a model they had in their office on a LARC and submitted that for this presentation that they were doing for a project in Louisville. And that became the very first viral architectural video. And viral by architectural means is not, it's kind of modest. We're not talking like, a billion views or anything, but that launched a whole new branch of activity in our studio doing videos for architects. When that video made the rounds, we saw that a lot of architects were interested in trying to leverage those animation tools in favor of making their project memorable, and also maybe showcasing some of the conceptual dimensions of the project that's very hard to capture in just a still image. Since then, we've been doing a lot of video production and still image production. I'd say it's maybe about percentage-wise, it's maybe about 60% video, 40% still images. In addition to that, our website division has grown into a full-blown agency where we're doing communications consulting and campaign management for nonprofits and cultural institutions, academic institutions, which means we're building their websites, but we're also helping them with messaging on social media, which is a big part of any marketing endeavor nowadays. Mm-hmm. And occasionally, those two branches of the studio team up to do a more synthetic approach to a marketing package where we'll be doing video production and animation and storytelling as a component within a larger interactive messaging campaign that will typically have a website and the associated social media channels. Where are we now? We are all over the place. We used to be in Brooklyn exclusively. We were in the Dumbo neighborhood for a while, this beautiful office overlooking the East River. We moved on to Gowanus when Dumbo just became a little too popular and a little too expensive. We had a wonderful studio just off of the canal on Carroll Street for a bit. And then the pandemic hit. And we held on to that office for about 3 or 4 months into the pandemic and decided, well, look, we've been working with a lot of our clients worldwide by remote prior to the pandemic. There was a time in our history where we would fly to exotic locations and meet with our clients. That was a lot of fun, but teleconferencing made, commuting unnecessary. And so we found that remote positioning made for a rather painless transition to an all remote work scenario. So right now we have a data center centrally located in Portland, Oregon. But all of our employees are now remote based. Many of them are in Brooklyn and Manhattan, but we also have a couple of team members in Philadelphia. We've got one in New Mexico. And then we've got 1 or 2 people on occasion out here on the West. We have members in LA. And for a while, we had one in Sao Paulo. Yeah, that person I think is now, if I remember correctly, they're in Tennessee at the moment. I think they're moving to New York City. And the power of the internet and the speed of the internet has made the remote working scenario a reality for us that we're very comfortable with and everybody's very happy with. We get together once a year. Everybody gets, we pick a destination on the East Coast. Usually it's New York City. I think this last year we got together in Boston. It's nice to see everybody real time, and we miss one another. And I'll see much of our CG crew on live shoots that we do on a fairly regular basis. I'll be back in New York City shooting live there in just a couple of weeks, as a matter of fact. But we see each other mostly through the computer.
And how many people are now working for the studio?
We've got 12.
12 people.
12 people. And so we're a very modest size agency as far as agencies go.
And one thing that strikes me is I remember reading somewhere, I don't know where, but about the salary difference in the U.S. Regarding the regions, and that it was an issue when the remote thing started because there were people that were employed in, let's say, San Francisco, where everything is more expensive, and they were being paid San Francisco salaries, and they were living, like in Miami, just to be extreme. And how do you guys manage that? Is there an actual difference now of salaries depending on the person or where that person is located, or how does it work?
I know some businesses have repositioned their outlay based on the new geographic reality of post-pandemic work. We did not. We were lucky enough to be busy enough such that we didn't have to make permanent adjustments to salaries. Although, the pandemic was the pandemic, and we all saw a lot of volatility during that time. There were certain economic programs in the United States that helped stabilize things quite a bit, but our studio does not have a policy of adjusting their incomes based on geographic location.
Cool. Then that's good. That's really good, because I've seen people having to leave their jobs because of that. Because during the pandemic, they decided to move back to where their family are or something like that, and then all of a sudden they got a decrease on their salaries.
And we were already sensitive to the idea that one's income is not necessarily entirely tied to the economics of where they are located at the moment. I mean, you've got plenty of people out there whose incomes are supporting a wider net of people who may not be located in that same proximity. On top of that, we were already working by remote largely with our clients. So for us, the geographic thing has never really been critical, despite the fact that we call ourselves the Brooklyn Digital.
Yeah. That sounds very geographical, right?
A little bit, right?
Yeah. And how's the market nowadays in the U.S.? I've heard some layoffs were going on in different industries. Are you guys affected by it, or do you see it affecting other studios?
I think one of my blind spots as part of the management over here is that I'm not talking enough to our peers about where they are economically, and I think that would be nice to have that data available in a wider sense. I mean, I know CGarchitect does provide the salary surveys and some other important kind of data points that we use to gauge how we manage our talent as well. But I'm not in contact with anybody on a kind of point-to-point basis enough to say, well, I kind of see our relative positioning is XYZ. I can tell you that 2023 saw a serious economic downturn about the middle of the year that didn't seem to affect our nonprofit clients just because of their position within the economy. I think that they're affected a little bit later in the overall stream of things, whereas real estate dropped off, I think, a bit more quickly. Because we're working in a wide number of a wide array of sectors within the global economy, a downturn in one area will often be buffered by an upturn in another. And for us right now, real estate is a little bit quiet, but other kind of architectural endeavors, which, well, you know how the NDA thing is, right? We're under non-disclosures over here. That's just would make you run and hide. I feel like we're running and hiding sometimes. But I mean, I could say that we're still pretty heavily involved with the architecture industry outside of questions of real estate marketing at the moment, which seems to be a little bit slower than some of the other corners of it.
And let me ask you, earlier we were talking about very different stuff, and we mentioned artificial intelligence. And do you see artificial intelligence actually having an impact in our industry?
Do I see it right now?
Yeah.
I guess it depends on how you define industry. Like, I know everybody that I speak with, a lot of our clients, and I know that we are experimenting with that technology every day. And it's certainly influencing the kinds of conversations we're having about work that's in the studio. But I don't know of anybody who is actively applying those tools in final products. And I think that's for two reasons. Either one, they don't want to tell people that because I think there's still some stigma with the idea that, like, the computer just kind of barfed it out and we just sold it to somebody, which there's something kind of unpalatable about that. I know that if I were to go to a lot of our clients and say, well, we're just going to AI something for y'all, I don't think that they would appreciate that as much as us, taking the time to properly prepare things in a methodical way and having a rich conversation with them, collaborating with them on making the image, which AI is not big on collaboration, as you know. Right now, it's you hand it some information, then you cross your fingers.
Yeah.
the other reason I think is because there is still a question of legal liability hovering around many of the visual components, and actually the text components for this as well. The New York Times has just weighed in legally about some of the co-opting of their material within the ChatGPT's algorithm. So OpenAI is currently examining that very closely. It's going to be interesting to see where that falls. And we at the studio here are concerned that those same liabilities will eventually show up in a sharper way within the visual tools that will cast some concern on the legality of those tools being present in the work that we do for our clients. So we have a very firm firewall at the moment between those tools and the work that we do, because we think there are a lot of important legal questions kind of playing themselves out at the moment. And we want to make sure that we end up on the right side of history when it comes to copyright infringement and how these tools are learning to do exactly what they do.
Yeah, and I can totally relate to that. I mean, I've been experimenting with AI myself, and like I've always have this feeling that maybe that image that came out of, I don't know, Midjourney or DALL-E or whatever, it's not actually original, and it's been done by someone else somewhere else at some other point, and I'm not always sure that that's an original, and that therefore I'm not always confident that I can use that image for any other purpose other than finding it fun or amusing.
Well, and that's where the tool has been useful to us, is that it generates conversation, and collaboration with our team happens through real-time dialogue about the values that our client is trying to capture in the work that they've asked us to do, and sometimes being able to generate material on a rapid basis to support conversations, we found that to be quite useful. Again, without bringing those images directly into the work, being able to clarify a point you're trying to make very quickly as we are working together has been a big time saver for us. But there have also been times when I've been working in Midjourney, I'll generate an image, and you'll see a Shutterstock watermark show up on the image,
or a signature.
Yeah, and you're like, oh, that's just not a good sign. So no, these tools are really important, and they've been so inspiring, and it's really wonderful to see the technology take on a life of its own, quite literally. But its dependence on prior work right now is a real difficult pill to swallow. I can tell you, nobody in our studio really harbors any serious reservations, philosophically, about the question of originality in these cases, because I feel like every time we do something, it's been inspired by something we saw. It could be a famous work of modern art, or maybe I went to the Museum of Modern Art recently, and I've been sitting in front of the Monets there for a few hours, and then I'll go back and work at my workstation to say that what I'm doing is entirely original after being inspired by such an important piece of work of art. Is very difficult for me to do. Now, of course, originality comes in more subtle forms than just outright tabula rasa, and so I think that's going to be the ideological gray area that makes incorporating things like Midjourney and ChatGPT easier in the future once these legal questions get answered.
Or in summary, once we actually know what we're doing.
Yeah, well,
that's pretty much it, right? Because people are using those tools and they have no idea what they're doing, and some of them I actually call them artists. They just I see that every day. People saying, I want, I don't know, Iron Man hugging Wonder Woman, and then look, this is illustration I did. No, you did not. And for me, the fear of the not that original outcome is real. I was doing some experiments like a week or two ago, and I started, describing Wonder Woman, just describing. She's an Amazon and she's a warrior and stuff like that. And once I started to add colors to the description, it simply returned Zack Snyder's Wonder Woman. Like in a heartbeat. It just became Gal Gadot. And that's what people probably are not realizing, that there's a threshold where it becomes something else, and the result is totally biased towards the direction, and you probably don't know which direction it is, and that's the main problem, because you'll be producing an image or a video or whatever, and you have no idea it's been done before, and there's an exactly copy of that video somewhere else.
Well, I think you pointed out something really interesting about that tool, is that the text-based approach, I think, more often than not, does default to, the visual paradigm that is most popular, or at least within the kind of like general kind of consciousness at the moment. The casting for the Marvel's movies, I think, has had a profound effect on those characters, and for reasons you just described. Whereas the visually based means for generating an image in those tools seems to have a lot more potential in terms of the outcome. For example, if we want to see an image of a building that has a kind of like sense of expansive space, like an Andreas Gursky photograph, we find it's way more effective to feed it an Andreas Gursky photograph and the subject, as opposed to typing it in, because as a result, like you might end up getting Ansel Adams instead of Andreas Gursky. So by that same token, like if you're looking for a specific subject, we find like having to sneak up on the tool is a lot more effective than taking the very direct route of just simply kind of typing it out. As dazzling as it is to be able to just type a sentence and see an image of it that is 90% of the way there.
It gives a sense of power, right? Like people feel empowered by it. Like I just say I want an image like that, and it creates something that I feel powerful.
Sure. No, I think what's really difficult for us old timers to accept is that the possibility that prompt design might actually become an industry, it seems very, very far-fetched. But I don't think anybody 20 years ago would have thought you could be an influencer on a video channel on the internet and make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, or possibly a month, depending on how popular it is. So I think we dismiss some of those ambitions at our own peril, because the tool might eventually show us how deadly precise it can be as they continue to tweak these algorithms. And at that point, the question of prompt design might really be part of our future. So it really remains to be seen.
And the funny thing is that you mentioned as our timers. Like I remember, like when I started college, in architecture college, it was in 1995, and there was no such thing as Awards Viz.
No.
Right. So I started college, and the profession I eventually chose didn't even exist at then.
Did you go to school in Sao Paulo?
Yeah.
So did you go to the FAC?
No, I went to McKinsey.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if you said. For those who are listening to this podcast, we were talking about architecture in Sao Paulo earlier. Yeah. The FAC is an amazing building. So I'm not familiar with the other institution you mentioned there, but like a little plug there for Brazilian architecture in general.
But the thing is, it wasn't a profession that did not exist at the time, and here I am. So we shouldn't be that much surprised when new professions come out of artificial intelligence, like prompt engineers and stuff like that.
That is such a good point. We are beneficiaries of that very dynamic, and so we need to continue to keep looking over our shoulders.
Yeah, all the time. John, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to and speaking for this. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. And well, we're here in case you need us once again. Just call me.
Sounds good, Ricardo. And thank you for your time today. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you. And it's been an honor to have been selected for CG Pro of the Year. And it really has been fabulous chatting with you. I look forward to seeing this episode on the podcast.
Awesome. So, and for you guys listening and watching us, thank you very much. And I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Take care.